An exciting new technology that could transform law enforcement, or a dangerous tool that opens the door to racial bias and mass surveillance. Facial recognition is rapidly expanding, but will its unregulated use create a new technological Wild West? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Rida Fakhri. We are 7.8 billion people in the world today, each one of us with a unique face, and each one of us with an expectation of anonymity as we move around in our daily lives. But the global rise of facial recognition technology is changing all that. We are being encouraged to tag our photos in social media postings and use our face to access our phones. Governments are scanning crowds to find suspected criminals and missing people, but also to surveil activists, protesters, and ethnic minorities. Using artificial intelligence, facial recognition cameras scan faces, then specialized software compares the images against a database of photos, sometimes instantly. And it is rapidly becoming a central theme in public and private surveillance networks. But have we found the balance between privacy and safety? Last Friday, London's Metropolitan Police Department announced that it will be using live facial recognition cameras to track down suspected criminals on city streets. The same day, New Jersey banned the state's law enforcement from using Clearview, a startup's facial recognition technology powered by 3 billion photos scraped from the web. Meanwhile, the European Commission is considering a moratorium on facial recognition in public spaces, while China is rapidly expanding its surveillance network. Katie Fisher takes a look at the global use of facial recognition technology.
Facial recognition technology is being used around the world, whether we like it or not. Powered by artificial intelligence, 64 countries are actively using the technology. In China, it's part of an elaborate surveillance program to catch jaywalkers, develop a social credit score system, and monitor the Uyghur Muslim ethnic group in Xinjiang. The Chinese government says it's being used to maintain order. China is now exporting the technology around the world, from Uganda to Zimbabwe to Serbia, a decision which sparked national protest. In Hong Kong, protesters are wearing masks out of fear of facial recognition technology.
Actually, we are afraid. We are afraid that Hong Kong will become Xinjiang 2.0 because the government is going to build a lot of facial recognition systems.
In India, technology intended to help find missing children was used by Delhi police to monitor a political rally last month. The country has plans to build the largest facial recognition program in the world. In Afghanistan, facial recognition technology was used during last year's election to combat fraud. Rights activists say it deterred female voters who cover their face from participating. The Israeli military has installed face scanners at border checkpoints for Palestinian workers crossing into Israel. Similar technology is reportedly also being used to surveil Palestinians in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. In the UK, South Wales police are using Japanese-made cameras equipped with real-time facial recognition to surveil crowds at concerts and sports events. Germany is piloting an automatic facial recognition program at Berlin's train station, a program the Interior Minister says is accurate 80% of the time. But it may be short-lived as the European Commission is considering a 5-year moratorium on the use of facial recognition technology. And in the U.S., a handful of cities have barred the use of facial recognition, and California recently put a 3-year ban on its use by law enforcement agencies. But there is no federal law in place.
And so while some American cities are banning the use of facial recognition technology, Detroit, Michigan, has taken a different approach. In September, the Police Oversight Board decided that rather than an outright ban, as many civil rights activists were calling for, it would put limits on its use by law enforcement. Joining me now to discuss that decision is Detroit Police Chief James Craig. Mr. Craig, a few states, as we say, in the United States have banned the use of facial recognition technology by law enforcement, not Michigan and not your city of Detroit, despite, as we say, many complaints and concerns raised by civil liberties groups. Why not?
Well, I got to tell you, it's really the approach. We're a constitutional police department, And what we've done very well as we began to talk about how we use facial recognition, we brought community groups in, a number of community groups, different demographics. We explain how we use the software. We bring them into the real-time crime center so they could see it used in real time. That went a long way in dispelling some inaccurate information that had been put out. As you probably...
What inaccurate information? I mean, you say that you brought in groups, but 12 civil rights organizations wrote a letter to the Detroit Board of Police Commissioners saying that they fear that facial recognition technology is both flawed and dangerous.
It's dangerous if it's used improperly. What we've demonstrated, we have a very rigorous policy in place to ensure that we don't use the technology improperly.
What is the oversight that's in place?
Well, I mean, there's tremendous rigor and a policy in place.
But just give me an example of what kind of
explain
regulation or oversight is in place.
We have peer review. We have trained analysts who actually use the software, and through the training that they receive is then peer reviewed by another trained analyst. And if there's a concurrence, then and only then it goes to a supervisor. A supervisor has a final say to say, you know what, I think this is a match based on the analyst's review. We don't rely on the software alone. If we were just to put in a picture into the software and let the computer do the work, it's going to misidentify most of the time.
But then do you agree that there is racial bias in the algorithms, that more often than not it misidentifies people with darker skin? And we're talking about Detroit, the city that is #1 ranked in the size of its African-American population. You've got an African-American population of 80%. Does it not bother you that this technology might misidentify people of color?
We don't misidentify. And I am trying to explain to you that we use the technology in such a way that it's the work of the analyst, not just the technology. We don't dispute that the technology is not where it should be, but it is the work of the analyst.
But you are relying on a technology that has been proven to be flawed in the way it identifies people with darker skins. This is what the Detroit Board of Police Commissioners, Willie Burton, has said. He says facial recognition does not work, and it has misidentified many people. We cannot afford to misidentify a single person. Do you disagree with him?
I don't disagree that we don't want one misidentification. I am suggesting to avoid misidentification, we have trained humans who make the decision on whether or not, and keep in mind, because we make an identification through the analyst's work, it's a tool only. We can't go out and make an arrest solely on an identification through facial recognition. We can't do it. In fact, the prosecutor will never sign an arrest warrant solely on identification.
But you are relying on this system, and you are putting it in place. You've got all these cameras all over Detroit. In fact, you've got more than 660 facial recognition cameras in Detroit in places like churches, restaurants, housing units. No, these are the facts. How then do you argue with those who say that it is creating a surveillance city?
When you say that we have facial recognition cameras in our 670 green light locations, not true. Facial recognition technology is a standalone software. Now, do we obtain still photos if a crime has been committed at a green light location and we look at a video and we see the image of a suspect? Yes, we will take a still photo and then take that still photo and insert it into the technology. The cameras themselves absolutely do not have facial recognition technology embedded.
There are lots of people, including members of Congress, who are concerned about the use of facial recognition technology in Detroit. Representative Rashida Tlaib, the Democrat whose district includes much of Detroit, says, "My city got scammed to believe that facial recognition is somehow going to keep us safer, and it hasn't."
I disagree with Tlaib, because she did not want to try to understand it. Instead, she came in closed off. I invited her to come in. And so inviting the community, I've had so many community members come in and see the demonstration. They've had a greater appreciation for it. They recognize, like I do, without controls, can the technology be misused? Absolutely.
What about the trust that you are trying to build with the African American community? You yourself said you need to work as one, right? This erodes the trust, doesn't it? You've got another Congresswoman, Ayanna Pressley, who says this technology is both untested and biased and would only criminalize, she says, vulnerable communities.
I disagree with her. What I am suggesting, again, is we understand the excitement surrounding facial recognition. So to mitigate that, we have brought in a number of community groups, journalists, clergy leaders throughout the city. So when you talk about building trust, it is important that we continue to sustain trust in the city of Detroit. And we've did, and I think, an above average job with that. So we take ownership. And we're transparent. So the use of this technology, we're not using it in an improper way.
But people are saying it does result, whether you like it or not, in greater surveillance and racial profiling.
We are not racial profiling. Let me give you another statistic. Admittedly, when you look at the crime in the city of Detroit, a rough estimate, more times than not, in excess of 85% of the suspects involved in violence in the city of Detroit are African American. We're not racially surveillant. We're racially sensitive. And so if the majority of the suspects that we identified are African American, more times than not, it will be African Americans or Hispanics that will go into the software.
But how are you being racially sensitive, though? Here you've got other people calling it techno-racism.
When we talk about something being techno-racism, it's how you use the technology. Now, let's say, for example, hypothetically, that a law enforcement agency, and there are law enforcement agencies, as you probably know, some who've been using the technology for as long as 20 years. The state of Michigan, Michigan State Police, have been using the technology for about 10 years. And so now Detroit Police Department using it as an aid to solve violent crimes, and it's troubling.
All right, Detroit Police Chief James Craig, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this interview.
You're welcome.
So as the U.S. waffles on the way forward, China is forging ahead. It is also exporting facial recognition technology to developing countries from Africa to Central Asia. One of those countries is Kyrgyzstan, where Chinese-made cameras are being installed. China reportedly provided the equipment for free. With the program still in its early stages, we went to the capital Bishkek to see how people feel about this new technology.
This place now one of the most monitored by cameras. For example, this camera, this one camera, a lot of cameras and almost 100% of safety. In this stage, this recognition of faces is not completely implemented, but I know that it is actually working.
Я думаю, что это очень необдуманный шаг. Вот когда мы таким образом наскоком взяли и разместили. Помимо того, что нарушаются права человека, нарушается его право на частную жизнь.
As a law-abiding citizen, I think this technology should be implemented, should be shared because of security and safety. We should find a balance between security of majority of our society and human rights. And in this sphere, we also should divide the human rights of criminals, human rights of law-abiding citizens. Actually, now they are apprehended.
Я, например, не знаю для чего. Зачем это нужно вот другой стране?
Kyrgyzstan is the nearest neighbor of the Chinese People's Republic. China achieved great success in controlling public places, in minimizing, even eradicating separatism, terrorism, extremism. The case of Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous District, Tibet. That's why these technologies, they proved their efficiency.
Не будет ли эти камеры с распознаванием лиц средством давления на гражданских активистов? Есть люди, которые не всегда могут, они могут быть более уязвимы, чем, допустим, я. Мы об этой программе ничего практически не знаем, абсолютно ничего. И наше Министерство внутренних дел, оно не предприняло необходимых шагов для того, чтобы обеспечить эту прозрачность. Кто их смотрит? Если это делает искусственный интеллект, на основе чего? Каким образом он из вот этого потока, сделанных, значит, снимков вот этого потока, он вычленяет нечто? Каким образом это делается? Извините, Гечер Койостер, сіз білесіздер бе, что сейчас вас камера снимает? Или не знаете? Вот смотрите, вот эта камера снимает каждого, кто проходит. Как вы считаете, это хорошо или нет? Жақсы же, қандай екен?
Жаман эле болуш керек.
Эмне үчүн жаман?
Каждый эле жөн кетип бараткан ичинде эле
Вот, видите? Они не знали. Вот обычные жители проходят мимо, и они не в курсе, что их снимают.
So many in Kyrgyzstan don't know that they're being watched, but what about the rest of the world? Is the rise of facial recognition inevitable? When is the use of the technology in the interest of national security and a need to maintain public order? And when does it restrict freedom of opinion, expression, and movement? Joining us now from Geneva is Kenneth Roth, the Executive Director at Human Rights Watch, and here in Washington, Sharon Bradford Franklin, Policy Director at New America's Open Technology Institute. Kenneth Roth, China is exporting this technology to several countries within Central Asia, sometimes free of charge. Many countries are obviously buying into it, but what is China's ultimate aim? Is it to control the data, to expand its influence along the Belt and Road, or is it something else?
Well, I think you have to look at what China is doing at home first. And the epicenter of the surveillance state that it's building is in Xinjiang, the northwestern region, where it is detained basically 1 million Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims for re-education. And the way it determines whom to detain is through the surveillance state that is set up. Facial recognition technology, together with pervasive video cameras and the use of big data analysis, are all key to figuring out, who is a threat and who isn't. And this threat is, obviously very subjective. It's basically anybody who's religious, anybody who doesn't speak Mandarin, anybody who follows traditional cultural practices. And so China's doing this with no sense of privacy at all. Indeed, police officers walk around with these handheld devices, which have 11 pages of data inside of them. And people literally have barcodes on their house so the police can know who's there and whether they pose a so-called threat or not. Now, China is gradually exporting this, and it's partly because it wants to win friends with autocratic governments who themselves want to keep tabs on their citizens. And as part of this whole Belt and Road initiative, which is a way of really kind of building friends and allies around the world to try to help China attack really the global system for defending human rights, because China is very afraid that that system might be applied to its own repression at home.
So Sharon, you've been looking at this technology here in the United States, how it's being used by many companies, how they are also building this surveillance system, whether they like it or not, and they're using it in other countries. This racial component to this discussion, the fact that there are racial flaws that are embedded in the system, does that to you suggest the reason why the Chinese, for example, are trying to export this technology to African countries? Some would say using some of these countries as a lab to experiment further with the technology, build its accuracy when it comes to detecting people with darker skins.
Well, I'm not familiar with whether the Chinese may be seeking to experiment on other countries, but I can speak to, as you mentioned, there have been a number of studies that have shown serious impact of inaccuracy and bias from facial recognition technologies, bias against people of color and women. In particular, there's one study showing, coming out of the United States National Institute of Standards and Technology, that has shown that false positive rates are up to 100 times higher for Asian and African American faces as compared to white faces. And another study coming out of MIT has shown that when you compound the effects by combining gender and race, we have inaccuracy rates of up to 35% higher for women of dark skin as compared to light-skinned men.
Yet law enforcement agencies in this country are using this technology despite the flaws. Is that a cause for concern?
That's very concerning, because you have much greater risks of inaccurate identification, including being inaccurately accused of being a suspect for a crime. And so we see that as a civil liberties impact, the increase of disparate impact on women and people of color. And there are also some serious civil liberties impacts, as Ken was discussing. We have a chilling of free expression. We have privacy impacts, because when the technologies can be accurate, it really sets up a system of control and tracking of people as they move throughout a jurisdiction and setting up a digital dossier of their movements.
So Kenneth Roth, from your perspective, what is the solution then? How do you regulate this technology when, let's face it, in the age of iPhone devices today with their tracking components, can you regulate this technology, and can you leave it to tech companies, the Amazons of this world, to write their own regulations and then hand them over to lawmakers?
You certainly cannot trust the data companies to regulate themselves. It's too profitable, this whole system. But let me just add 2 points to what Sharon accurately described. I mean, one is that the problem is not simply inaccuracy in facial recognition technology. It's also bias built into data that is fed into artificial intelligence. So, for example, if the police are going to decide where to deploy their resources based on historical data, and historically the police have concentrated in areas where minorities or poor people live, obviously they're going to decide that that's the high crime area, and they'll deploy their policing resources in this ongoing discriminatory way. So the answer to that is much greater transparency to allow for biases to be checked in all of these systems. The other thing, as you noted, and it's not just facial recognition technology, it's also our mobile phones, which act as tracking devices as well, is that we're used to thinking of privacy as simply something that happens inside your bedroom, inside your house, in private communications. But indeed, we've all depended on a degree of privacy, even out in public, because for the most part, the government doesn't have the resources to follow all of us. But suddenly, your phone is a tracking device. The data is all there. It can piece together everything you did in your day. This is all now available to the police and increasingly available to private companies that collect this data. We urgently need standards to regulate this aspect of our privacy in public.
Can I build on the regulation point? So I'd like to distinguish between government use and law enforcement use in particular on the one hand, and private or commercial use on the other. In the context of private and commercial use, we absolutely need strict regulations governing how companies can retain the data, how they can use it, can they sell those images, and so forth. And particularly in the United States, this should be part and parcel of consumer privacy legislation, which we sorely need. But when you look to government uses and law enforcement uses in particular, we don't believe that there are adequate safeguards that can be put in place to mitigate it against this risk. So that's why my organization, the Open Technology Institute, and a whole host of other organizations have called for a moratorium on the use of law enforcement use of facial recognition technologies, because the threats to privacy, civil liberties, civil rights are just so severe.
And Kenneth Roth, when we look at the bigger picture of what all this means, when you look at the surveillance state that many countries in the world are moving towards, and the staggering statistics that show that by the year 2021, I believe there will be some 1 billion cameras in different places around the world. Chinese companies supplying AI surveillance tech to 63 countries, according to a study by Carnegie. But China isn't the only one. There are many companies in the United States and in other so-called liberal democracies that are also proliferating this technology. Are we always too quick to jump on the Chinese use or misuse of this technology and turn a blind eye when other countries use it as well?
The technology is not that complicated. Lots of governments are developing it. The Chinese are just more advanced in deploying it. But I think what we've seen is that the technology is moving much more quickly than the ability to regulate it. And we need standards developed very fast. We can't wait for global standards. That'll take forever, and the Chinese and Russians will insist on a very low standard. So we need, for example, like the European Union, to come together very quickly, develop high standards, and then use companies' desire for access in Europe, try to use that to spread those standards more globally.
Kenneth, Roth, Sharon, Bradford, Franklin, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
And so despite these significant concerns about inaccuracy and racial bias, in addition to privacy issues, police and other security agencies are all too often eager to use facial recognition technology. And the trend is likely to continue, with major tech companies and governments working together without stringent laws or regulation. Whether it is China, the US, France, Germany, Japan, Israel, or India, governments are promising public safety and efficiency, choosing to invest in a system that many view as flawed and vulnerable to hacking. And with technology becoming cheaper, many other governments will now be tempted to follow suit and surveil their own citizens in the name of security. From me, Rida Fakhri, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.